Hi guys, Olive here today to review two nonfiction books on Siberian tigers. The first book I'll be discussing is titled The Great Soul of Siberia, Passion, Obsession, and One Man's Quest for the World's Most Elusive Tiger by Sooyong Park. This book was published in 2015 by Greystone Books, which is an independent publisher. It was translated from Korean by Jamie Chang, and the hardcover copy that I checked out from my library comes in at 340 pages. This book is part memoir, part wildlife observations, and it was written by a filmmaker rather than a scientist. Park actually didn't have an extensive background studying these big cats, but he became interested in them later on in his life. And now he's probably one of the very few people here on Earth who has witnessed firsthand intimate moments in the lives of wild Siberian tigers in Russia's Far East. And he has that experience because of his very unique methodology, we'll say. He would spend months at a time in these shelters, bunkers, really, you should call them, trying to blend in with the natural surroundings as much as he possibly could so he didn't spook these very cautious creatures. He was dealing with all of the elements, brutally cold conditions, since this was mainly undertaken during the winter, just for the chance to hopefully get to see tigers in their natural environment. In order to know where to put these camps, though, where he would have the best chance of actually seeing a tiger, they had to do their research first. They had to track the tigers. And the earliest sections of this book are kind of like a lesson in field research. We learn about basic tiger anatomy and behavior. We learn about their tracks, their pug marks as they're known, and what the size of those can teach us about a tiger's sex and their age, as well as their movement. We can track tigers where they normally go. He calls whatever tigers leave behind their traces. Think trace evidence, like in forensic science. So he and his team used all of this data to figure out where the tigers typically moved throughout the forest so they could find the best places to have these stakeouts. Not many people would be dedicated enough, or should I say unhinged enough, to plant themselves in a hole in the middle of the Russian forest during the winter, just for the chance to maybe get to glimpse a tiger in its natural environment without it knowing that you're there. But once they pick the locations, that is precisely what our author did. And he did it multiple times over a period of years. However, I, for one, am sure glad he did so because he got to know 3 generations of a tiger family during his years of doing this, and he introduces them to us in this book. So we get to meet the matriarch, an experienced female named Bloody Mary, who earned that nickname by the locals because of her particularly messy way of killing her prey. We get to meet her nearly grown cubs. They're juveniles, but getting ready to be independent at the time we first meet them in the book. We get to meet their father, the dominant male of this region, the Great King, as he's called. But then later on, we get to see Bloody Mary's cubs all grown up and starting families of their own. Though tigers are quite solitary by nature, Park was able to see that they also have very rich social lives. He saw them showing affection toward their family members. He saw the cubs learning from their mothers and taking those lessons into their adult lives. He saw the cubs playing together, protecting each other, not wanting to let each other go. But then he also saw tigers hunting unusual types of prey. All of this information would later go on to stun scientists at the time, if only because many of these behaviors just hadn't been witnessed in wild tigers before. We just live so separately from them. They fear humans for good reason. Life in the forest is brutal. These cats are up against a lot. There's a reason why they're endangered. Their habitats are dwindling. Poachers are forever going after them. They can get hit by cars. Some years they don't have enough to eat. It's hard for them to survive even when all the conditions are right. The harsh realities of nature are all over this book. Therefore, it's not for the faint of heart. It can be touching one moment and then absolutely heartbreaking the next. There are other elements to this book, though, that help it achieve a really good balance. Because it is about the tigers, but it's also about more than that. It's also about this very specific region of the Russian Far East where they live. We get to learn about the native peoples of this region, how they feel about the tigers, what their way of life is like, what their spirituality is, how it was largely repressed during the Soviet era. But there's also a lot in here about what it was actually like for Sooyong Park to just sit and wait for these tigers for such long stretches of time, what the physical realities of that were like. He does take us through the day-to-day, how he met all of his needs while doing this, but then also what the conditions were like. How it was so cold that your eyes could freeze shut while you sleep, how you're sitting for so long that your muscles begin to atrophy. It was tough on his body as well as his mind. It's not a good thing for a human to be so totally isolated from society. I mean, tigers may live largely solitary lives, but we humans are very social creatures. And effectively, he put himself into solitary confinement for months on end. And it was very challenging for him. He experienced intense loneliness. He was often very bored, ran out of reading material very quickly. And he would go excruciatingly long periods of time without a single sighting of a tiger. They were moving around their territory while he just held down the fort and waited for them to come back. It was really frustrating for him at times. He had moments of wanting to give up, but he always somehow managed to push through and stick with this project. And I was just amazed by his patience, his dedication, the deep respect that he clearly has for nature. But I also love the way that he conveyed the resilience of these tigers, their intelligence, their love for one another, and their fight for survival. On top of all of that, this book has all of that going on, but it also just so happens to be gorgeously written. It has such a sense of atmosphere to it. In 1 second, you're experiencing a quiet moment in the bunker, and then the very next second, you can feel the terror coursing through his veins as it seems like a tiger might be onto his hiding spot. Reading this was just so immersive. I felt like I was surrounded by this world on all sides. But reading this book also kind of felt like a spiritual experience. I swear this book was like a weighted blanket for my brain because as soon as I picked it up, I felt this sense of calm. I felt my entire world disappear, and instead I was just in that bunker with him, watching the lives of these tigers. I think it helped that I read this book at the right time. It is a lot slower paced, it's a lot more thoughtful, and I think that really suited this time of year as things are starting to slow down heading into the holidays and then the end of the year. I think if you're anything like me and you enjoy reading seasonally, you'll want to pick this one up during the winter. And not just because a lot of his research happened during the winter months, but also I just think it suits this time of year. I actually read a good chunk of this book as we were getting our very first snow of the season. It wasn't very much snow, it never is here in Pittsburgh during November. But reading this while flakes were gently falling outside my window, it was sublime. So I loved this, obviously. I highly recommend it. And I think it actually may have worked out for the best that I read this 10 years after its initial publication because I just heard a rumor that there's going to be a follow-up, a sequel to this book, possibly coming out next year. I will be delighted if that turns out to be true, especially if that new book is similar to this one and also mentions the other creatures of the forest, because as he was sitting and waiting for tigers to show up, he got to meet all the other wildlife residents in this area, including an old friend of mine who I was tickled to see again, the Eurasian eagle owl. Where I first met those birds, though, is in a book I read and reviewed a few years ago. It's called Owls of the Eastern Ice by Jonathan C. Slaght, who just so happens to be the author of the next book that I'm going to be talking about, Tigers Between Empires, The Improbable Return of Big Cats to the Forests of Russia and China. This book was published in 2025 by FSG, which is a division of Macmillan. The hardcover comes in at 512 pages. However, I read an advance e-copy of this book that I accessed for free for reviewing purposes through NetGalley. I think this is actually the very first instance of a repeat author in these 2 books on videos that I make. The very first one I ever did was 2 books on owls, in which I discussed Owls of the Eastern Ice. And now here we are, all these years later, ready to discuss his newest book. You may be wondering what could have inspired the exact same man to write 2 different books, one on owls, one on tigers, but he actually works in wildlife conservation in Russia's Far East, where populations of both of them call home. So location is what they have in common. Tigers Between Empires is essentially the soup to nuts story of what was known as the Siberian Tiger Project, a research project that brought together Russian and American scientists following the fall of the Soviet Union and then into the early 21st century. And the study aimed to answer questions about these apex predators that had been driven to near extinction. Not much was known about their surviving populations, and they wanted to know how the government, how people could help the tigers, but they needed to start with data. And the way they went about doing that is by tracking tigers, tagging them, monitoring them once they were tagged, and then in a few cases, raising and releasing tigers. Those tasks are easy for me to sit here and list, but much more difficult to actually pull off. Even the locals of this area had no idea even where to begin trying to wrangle a tiger enough that you could put a collar on it so you could track it. They'd never even heard of such a thing. They thought it was impossible. So these researchers really had their work cut out for them, trying to figure things out along the way. And it was a very messy learning process. There was a lot of danger involved for everybody, for the cats as well as the researchers and other creatures in this region as well. There is a very scary and very sad story about a bear in here. To understand how tigers got to this moment of crisis, though, it's really important to understand historical context and where this space was at the time that this project was going on. And this author provides an abundance of that information because he's so knowledgeable about this area. I mean, to say that Russia and the whole post-Soviet space was chaotic during the 90s would be a massive understatement. Think about it. One massive nation collapsed and broke apart into all of these little pieces. All of a sudden, all these different areas have to figure out how to govern themselves because not all the instructions were coming from on high anymore. Then later on in the decade, the ruble collapsed. There was even more economic insecurity after the transition to a market economy. Then at the end of 99, Yeltsin, the president who did take over, stepped down, or should I say drunkenly stumbled down. Chaos, turmoil is the best way to put it. And this obviously had an effect on public lands and the way that they were, or should I say, were not managed. That's such an important part of this story. I knew a good deal about that, but that's only because I have an extensive Russian and Soviet history background. Not everyone's going to have that. So I think it was so important that the author included that. I think it's one of the most valuable parts of this book. Since much of that information is provided at the start of this book, though, which is the logical place to put it, it does get a little bit info dumpy. You can sometimes forget that this is a story about tigers. His entire approach in this book is a historical one. He's telling the story, the history of this project. And I think the main difference between this book and his last book is that this isn't his story, whereas Owls of the Eastern Ice was his story. That was his research. He's only on the periphery of this story. He works in this area. He knows people who were involved. He interviewed them for this book, and I am sure the legacy of this project has an impact on his day-to-day. But this is all information gleaned from extensive research and from interviews versus his own observations in the field. And I think he's a lot less practiced in telling other people's stories because I found that there was substantial room for improvement when it came to the storytelling in this book. I found many violations of the show don't tell rule, which is also a rule for nonfiction. Nonfiction also needs to be exciting to read. These are tiger encounters, for God's sake. They need to come to life for us. And where sometimes the writing could be exciting, oftentimes I found it fell flat. And I will admit, I may have been primed to be disappointed by this because I had just read The Great Soul of Siberia. And while I was reading that, I swear I could feel those tigers' breath on my face because it was written so well. But throughout the entire story of this project, its highs and its lows, its successes and its failures. It's so easy to get invested. I found myself growing more and more fond of all of the individuals that we meet throughout this story, human and cat alike. I was cheering everybody on, having a really good time doing it. I think what this author never had to worry about working on is the heart that he put into this. He deeply cares, and it shows. It's a good book. It was extensively researched. It was decently entertaining, certainly at different points. But I just think it's perhaps not as accomplished as his previous book. Definitely not as personal. I will say it always was going to face an uphill battle to win a good rating from me, considering the book I had finished immediately before it. But when combined with that previous book, I do think it added a lot of really important geopolitical context that made the precarious situation of these tigers all the more understandable. But those were my thoughts on these 2 books on tigers. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Have you read either or both of these? Do you want to? Did I maybe talk you into reading one or more of them? I always love hearing about that. If you want to get your hands on a copy of either one of them, I have put links to where you can do so in the description box below. And also, in that exact same description box, I've included something that I like to call the further reading section, where I've listed some additional book titles you might want to check out if this is a topic that interests you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.